Thank you for choosing American Pest CEUs. Hi, I'm Sean Reeves. I'm an Associate Certified Entomologist with American Pest CEUs. I've been in the pest management industry since 1999, and I'll be your instructor for today's course. Today's course was compiled by Jack Launius, who has served in the pest management industry since 1990. Today's course is on Core Chapter 6, Personal Protective Equipment. Protect yourself. You only live once. After studying this chapter, you should be able to identify where on the label to find the minimum clothing and personal protective equipment, PPE, required to handle a given pesticide product. State the criteria to properly select skin, eye, and respiratory protection required by the pesticide label based upon your expected use and exposure. List 3 work practices, each for correct use of gloves, footwear, and eyewear that minimize pesticide exposure and contamination. Finally, list the signs of wear and tear, damage, or other PPE failures that may expose you to pesticides. You will be able to explain the importance of wearing respiratory protection devices approved by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. Tell when to replace particulate filters and chemical cartridges or canisters on your respirator. Distinguish between a fit test and a seal check for tight-fitting respirators. Describe how to clean and maintain pesticide-contaminated work clothes and PPE, and describe how to dispose of PPE when necessary. Let's talk about personal protective equipment. The pesticide label prescribes handling precautions, personal protective equipment or PPE, and other safety measures to minimize your exposure while handling pesticides. PPE comprises the clothing and devices you wear to protect your body from contact with pesticides. Wearing PPE can reduce exposure, dermal, inhalation, ocular or oral, and thereby lower the chances of pesticide injury, illness, or poisoning. Basic protective work clothing consists of a long-sleeve shirt, long pants, closed-toed shoes, and socks. PPE, as defined by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, includes coveralls, apron, gloves, footwear, headgear, eyewear, and respirators. Let's talk about that for just a moment. A lot of you are going to be taking core pesticide exams, and these are some of the things you're going to need to remember. What does basic work clothing consist of? You need to remember that basic protective work clothing consists of a long-sleeve shirt, long pants, closed-toed shoes, and socks. You need to remember this not just because it can be a common question on core exams, but you also need to understand how to protect yourself with these basic types of protective work clothing. It's also really important that you remember, what does the EPA define PPE as? PPE, as defined by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, includes coveralls, apron, gloves, footwear, headgear, eyewear, and respirators. I'm going over this again because these are things you definitely need to remember. Again, PPE defined by the EPA includes coveralls, apron, gloves, footwear, headgear, eyewear, and respirators. These things are important for you to go out in vehicles and do services. You never know when you're going to need any one of these types of PPE, so make sure they're always on your vehicle. And again, make sure you remember what's defined as PPE by the EPA for any of your core exams. It is important that all pesticide applicators and handlers understand the protections and limitations of PPE. Although PPE may reduce your exposure to pesticides, it does not necessarily eliminate it. Proper PPE selection, use, and care are essential. The following are some good work practices that you should always follow when using pesticides. We also need to understand good work practices. It is important to take basic steps to reduce exposure when you handle pesticides or work in pesticide-treated areas. Remember to use common sense. No guidelines are going to cover all situations. I just want to mention one thing here. Always use common sense. You can know all the guidelines and you can know all these things about pesticides and labels and PPE. If you don't use common sense, you're going to get in trouble. If something doesn't feel right, stop, think about it, read the label, check the PPE, and then reassess the situation. It never makes sense to do something that's not making sense to you before you confirm if it's right or not. Some good work practices include things like preventing oral exposure, never eat, drink, chew gum, use tobacco products, or handle cell phones while working with pesticides. Contaminated hands are a source of oral exposure to pesticides. Other good work practices include preventing dermal exposure. Wash your hands before using the toilet. The groin area readily absorbs pesticide. Wear a minimum of a long sleeve shirt, long pants, and closed-toed shoes. Do not wipe contaminated gloves on your clothing. The pesticide may seep through. Good work practices also include things like preventing ocular exposure. To do this, you need to wear protective eyewear to protect from splashes, sprays, mist, fogs, and aerosols. You also need to think about preventing inhalation exposure. This can be done through avoiding breathing in dust, spray droplets, or vapors. You're going to need to wear a respirator when needed, even if the label does not require it. There's some real simple facts here I just want you to remember. When it comes to ocular exposure, it's really easy for you to get pesticide in your eyes from splashes, sprays, mists, fogs, and aerosols. So just make sure you really watch your eyes, especially on windy days. Those sprays, mist, and fogs can really come back in your face. And obviously, like I said, when you're mixing a pesticide, it's very easy for it to splash back up. Now, avoiding the breathing in of dust, spray droplets, or vapors, you need to understand just because a label doesn't say you have to wear a respirator doesn't mean you shouldn't. Once again, we talked about common sense. You're the one out there making decisions. Make sure if you feel like for any reason you need to wear a respirator that you do, because you can always go above and beyond what the label calls for PPE. The PPE on the label is just the minimum required. Next, as it relates to best practices, you need to decontaminate yourself and your PPE. You're going to want to wash your gloves with soap and water before you take them off. Remove them and wash your hands and face. Immediately wash off any pesticide that gets directly on you. Remove and replace damaged or contaminated clothing or PPE. Have spare clothing available. At the end of the day, wash or replace contaminated PPE. You need to shower at the end of the workday. Wash your hair and scalp and under your fingernails. Put on a complete change of clothing after you shower. Launder your work clothes separately from non-work and other clothes at the end of each workday. Good concepts you want to remember in this slide. You always have to remember you're going to need to wash your gloves with soap and water before you take them off. So if you're just going out there and you're working with pesticides, you're getting them all over your gloves, and then you're trying to pull one glove off with one hand, the other with the other hand, chances are you're going to come into contact with that pesticide. You need to wash your gloves while they're still on with that soap and water. At that point, when you go to take them off, that pesticide has been neutralized. It's been washed away with the soap and water. Again, this relates to keeping yourself safe and exam prep. You're going to need to wash off any pesticide that gets directly on you. I know that sounds kind of crazy, I would have to say that, but it's really important for you to understand. If you get pesticide on you, wash it off immediately. It's always important for you to remember that any damaged or contaminated clothing or PPE needs to be replaced. Don't go out there with ripped up clothing or clothing that has pesticides on it or PPE and think you can just get through the workday. Just have spare clothing available. At the end of each workday, always wash or replace contaminated PPE. Do not put PPE back in your truck, back on a shelf, contaminated with pesticides. As you can see, the pesticide's just going to spread at that point, and then again at the end of the next day, you could come into contact with that pesticide. The other two quick things is, obviously you need to shower at the end of the workday. You're going to understand, anytime you've been applicating with pesticides, especially where some may have gotten in your hair, some may have gotten on your face, or even your arms, depending on what type of application you were doing. Can you imagine on a windy day a pesticide kind of blowing back on you a little bit? Make sure you take a really good shower at the end of the day and launder your work clothes separately from non-work and other clothes. These are important concepts to protect your health, but these are also great exam prep topics because you'll constantly see questions like this on core exams. Protect yourself from pesticides. A pesticide label lists the minimum PPE that an applicator, handler, and early entry worker must wear. Wearing anything less is illegal and dangerous. All pesticide handlers, e.g. applicators, mixers, and loaders and flaggers, are responsible for following the pesticide label, including wearing PPE. Just remember, a pesticide label lists the minimum PPE that an applicator, handler, and early entry worker must wear. This is the minimum. It doesn't say that you can't wear more. If you feel like you need more, go ahead and wear more. It's never going to be a bad thing to overuse PPE. It's only going to help keep you safer. PPE requirements are typically listed under the precautionary statements section of the pesticide label. If you work in or on a farm, forest, nursery, or greenhouse, look for additional PPE requirements listed in the agricultural use requirements box on the label. Also, always check to see if state regulations are more restrictive than label requirements. Again, PPE requirements are typically listed under where? Precautionary Statements section of the label. A label's precautionary statements outline the health risk associated with exposure to the product, ways to minimize exposure, and what to do in case of exposure or poisoning. The precautionary statements section usually consists of several different components and vary according to a product's toxicity, formulation, and approved uses. One simple but important component that must be on practically every pesticide label is the child hazard warning statement, i.e., keep out of reach of children. The hazards to humans and domestic animals statements are accompanied by the product signal word. These statements are required for products in toxicity classes 1, 2, and 3. Common examples include harmful if swallowed and do not get on eyes, on skin, or on clothing. Personal protective equipment statements appear under the precautionary statement section. Because different jobs carry varying degrees of risk, labels sometimes require people in certain roles to wear more personal protective equipment, PPE, than others. For example, mixers and loaders sometimes must wear more PPE than applicators because, unlike the applicator, they will be handling concentrated pesticide. PPE requirements for other scenarios, such as aerial applications or early entry work in agriculture, often appear elsewhere on the label. I want to do a quick recap on this. Where do personal protective equipment statements appear on the label? Under the precautionary statements section. Remember this because you're always going to need to look for PPE when using a product. And again, this is going to be on a lot of core exams. The other thing you must remember, when you're mixing or loading a pesticide, you're dealing with the actual concentrate. So the PPE a lot of times is going to be a lot more when you're mixing or loading a product. That's because you could come in contact with the actual concentrate, and as you know, when you're working with the full concentrated product like that, it can be a lot more toxic to you. For example, a label may allow you to wear less PPE when engineering controls, e.g. enclosed cab, are used, but the state, tribal, or territorial pesticide regulatory agency may prohibit this practice. Additionally, some states have more restrictive occupational health and safety regulations specific to pesticide applicators or to protect commercial sector workers such as landscapers or pest management professionals. The point being made here is you have to understand not just the federal law with pesticides, you also have to understand your state laws. What I would suggest you do is Always make sure you keep up to date with your state laws or your tribal laws, whoever's jurisdiction you're under, to make sure you're up to date on the laws and that you're not outside of regulations. When a state, tribal, or local regulation is more restrictive than federal pesticide laws, it must be followed. Under EPA's Worker Protection Standard, WPS 40 CFR Part 170, agricultural employers are legally required to provide PPE that is in good working order. They also must train pesticide handlers on the use, proper use, and maintenance of label-required PPE. PPE label requirements vary depending upon the toxicity, formulation, dilution, and route of exposure of the pesticide product and activity. For example, a single label may have one set of PPE requirements for applicators and a different set for agricultural early entry workers going into areas during the restricted entry interval. Again, the point we're making here is any laws or overlays to that federal pesticide law must be followed. Again, when a state, tribal, or local regulation is more restrictive than those federal pesticide laws, it must be followed. It's kind of basically like an overlay of the federal law that's even a higher level of protection in that local area. Even very low hazard pesticides require a long sleeve shirt, long pants, shoes, and socks. Consider all work situations when using PPE may be hazardous. Be careful around moving equipment parts, such as a power takeoff unit, that can catch apron strings. Protective clothing can restrict evaporation of sweat, thus impeding the body's natural cooling system and causing heat-related illnesses, including heat stress. I just want to make one point there when it comes to heat stress. When you're wearing a lot of heavy PPE, when you're wearing respirators, you're wearing gloves, you're wearing aprons, you're wearing thick boots, keep in mind heat stress can be a really big deal. Those of you working in hot and or humid areas really deal with this, but think about even when you're going in an attic. I could be in Minnesota and it could be 90 degrees outside in the summer. I go up in an attic, it could be 30 degrees hotter. Really quickly I could start suffering from heat stress, especially if I'm wearing the correct PPE, which in a lot of cases will be respirators and things like that. So I just want you to be aware. Obviously, you need to wear the PPE, but monitor heat stress and make sure that you don't succumb to getting too hot and having a heat stress type of illness. Protect your body. Different types of clothing, aprons, hats, boots, and gloves are not equally protective against all pesticides and under all conditions. For PPE to be protective, it must shield your skin, head, face, neck, trunk, arms, legs, and feet from exposure throughout the pesticide handling activity. It must be durable and resist punctures and tears during normal use. It must be comfortable enough without restricting your movement, so you will wear it. To protect your skin, your normal work clothing must cover most of your body. Depending on the product's toxicity and use, other PPEs such as coveralls, apron, hats, boots, and gloves may also be required. Protective clothing, gloves, and boots must provide a barrier for the duration of the task when you are exposed to a pesticide. Labels may require waterproof gloves or boots. Additionally, chemical-resistant gloves, aprons, hats, boots, or suits are required on some labels. EPA defines chemical-resistant as preventing any measurable amount of material from moving through, breaking through the fabric or material. Things that can affect the extent of breakthrough are contact, time, concentration, temperature, and the product itself. When sealed correctly, protective clothing reduces the risk of dermal exposure, but does not eliminate it. Two key takeaways from this slide: understanding what we mean by breakthrough. So that would be like the product moving through the PPE. So there is a chance that products can break through your PPE. You need to remember the things that can affect this, at least the extent of the breakthrough, are contact time, concentration, temperature, and the product itself. Those all make sense. Think about the product itself. The toxicity of the product is going to have a lot to do with how it can break through your PPE. Also, the other thing you want to remember, correctly selecting PPE does reduce the risk of dermal exposure, but it does not eliminate it. You may see some of these questions on exams when you're looking at the core exams, and just keep in mind, it's not 100% going to eliminate exposure if you ever get asked that question. Work clothing. Your work clothes provide a basic barrier to minimize pesticide contact with your skin. Always wear, at a minimum, a long sleeve shirt, long pants, closed-toed shoes, clothes made of tightly woven fabrics to reduce pesticide penetration. Make sure they are free of holes and tears. Fasten the shirt collar completely to protect the lower part of your neck. Do not use these work clothes for anything other than handling pesticides. Store and launder fabric work clothing separately from all other clothing after each day's use. Let's talk further about good work practices, basic work clothes. Always wear at a minimum of long sleeve shirt and long pants. Make sure work clothes are sufficiently durable. Wash work clothes at the end of the day separate from other clothing. Another type of PPE commonly used by pest control professionals is coveralls. Some pesticide labels require coveralls, a second layer of clothing, over work clothes. According to regulations, coveralls must be loose-fitting, 1 or 2-piece garments that cover the entire body except head, hands, and feet. A coverall can be made of woven, like cotton or twill, or non-woven fabrics. It should be either easy to clean and sturdy enough for laundering and repeated use, or disposable. Wearing a disposable coverall reduces decontamination time, and it lowers the risk of contaminating yourself, your application equipment, and your vehicle. And there's a lot of different scenarios where you would wear coveralls. Let's take if you're a pesticide technician. You may be going in somewhere like a crawl space. You could be going into a crawl space of a home using a product like a BoraCare spraying under floor joists. If you're wearing one of these suits and it's like a cotton suit, just a standard coverall, you get back in your truck. If you don't take it off, you sit down in your seat and things like that, you've got the product all over you. Obviously, you're going to have an issue. Now, if you're using a disposable suit, at the end of your application, you can take that off, you can put it in a trash bag, and you can completely get rid of it. At minimum, if you're going to use like a standard coverall suit, like a cotton type, just make sure as soon as you're done with the application, you take it off, you separate it from the rest of your vehicle, probably put it in a garbage bag or something like that, and then take it home and launder it separately from any other clothing. Disposable coveralls differ in their level of protection. Most importantly, wearing coveralls lessens the chance that you will take pesticides home. Handle disposable coveralls carefully so as to not contaminate other people. Very few pesticides require a chemical-resistant coverall. If one is required, a well-designed coverall makes it hard for pesticides to get through to your inner clothing or skin. It also makes a lot of sense to use an apron for mixing. Some pesticide labels require you to wear a chemical-resistant apron when mixing or loading a pesticide or when cleaning application equipment. Select aprons that cover the front of your body from the middle of the chest to the knees. I would always suggest wearing an apron when mixing. It only makes sense. Why wouldn't you want to protect yourself? Why would you want to worry about something splashing up and getting on your clothing? It always makes sense to wear an apron to me, and even if the label doesn't call for it, I would always say it's a good idea to do so. Let's talk about headgear for overhead applications. If an overhead application may result in exposure, a pesticide label may require chemical-resistant headgear. This headgear must protect against sprays so that no liquid breaks through the hat or hood. You may use either a chemical-resistant hat with a wide brim or a hood. Hoods attached to jackets or suits protect your neck and back from pesticide sprays that might otherwise run down your back. Wash headgear at the end of the day. When making overhead applications, do not use headgear made of absorbent material, such as cotton, leather, or straw. Let's be honest with ourselves when we talk about headgear and overhead applications. Anytime you're treating over your head and you're spraying something up into the air, what goes up must come down, right? So you have to understand when you're spraying upwards, it's going to come down. Now, you might be shooting it at an angle or something like that, but what's the chances that the wind's going to blow some of it back too? How many of you know we don't get many days when there's absolutely no wind? Keeping all that in mind, this is why headgear is so important. I really like the hard hat with the face shield. I think that's a really good protection, but it's not always needed or applicable. And if you walk into somebody's residential yard with that, you may have a whole nother issue where they're really freaked out about what you're doing. So just make sure you know when you're treating overhead, make sure you have the correct headgear, and sometimes that would include even a face shield. Another very important thing we need to think about when it comes to protecting ourselves from pesticides is footwear. Many pesticide labels require you to wear shoes and socks. Make sure the shoes have closed toes. However, some product labels require you to wear chemical-resistant footwear. A heavy-duty pair of unlined rubber boots or shoe covers provides protection from pesticides. Wash them inside and out at the end of the day. Leather and canvas absorb pesticides and cannot be decontaminated. Regulations allow you to substitute leather for chemical-resistant boots only when the chemical-resistant footwear required by the pesticide label is not durable enough for use in rough terrain. Do not use these boots for other purposes. Good work practices when it comes to footwear. Never wear open-toed shoes or sandals when applying pesticides. Wear heavy-duty rubber boots that extend past your ankle and at least halfway up to your knee if you will enter or walk through treated areas before spray is dried. Put your pant legs outside your boots to prevent pesticides from running down your legs and becoming trapped in your footwear. Do not use footwear used for applying pesticides for anything else. Do not wear footwear in your home. Couple quick notes on this slide, and again, this is something you want to know to protect yourself and for exam prep. You definitely want to make sure that you wear heavy-duty rubber boots that extend up past your ankle and at least halfway to your knee, especially if you're walking through areas that have been treated. This is especially true for those of you doing lawn and ornamental work, those of you doing agricultural work, and even rights-of-way work. You're going out there, you're putting the product in a big, large area, you're treating big swaths of land, and at that point, you're going to be walking right through the pesticides themselves. And putting your pant legs outside of your boots, I can't tell you how many times I've seen that question on a core exam. If you think about it like this, I've seen people that tuck their pant legs down inside their boots. Obviously, if you get a product on your pants, it's going to run right down into your boots if you have the pant legs tucked down inside of them. I don't know why people do that. Maybe it's a style thing, but it's definitely not something you want to do. Also, when you have footwear that you're using for applying pesticides, don't wear them inside your home. You don't want to wear these in areas where you're going to track those pesticides in. I know it seems like something simple, but I can't tell you how many people I know that probably go home, they wear their boots or whatever they were wearing to do pesticide applications right into their home. At that point, what are you really doing? You're tracking those pesticides in, and of course at this point, now they're on your floors and they're spreading throughout your home. Let's talk about gloves. Pesticide handlers get by far the most exposure from pesticides on their hands and forearms. Research has shown that workers mixing pesticides received 85% of the total exposure on their hands and 13% on their forearms. The same study showed that wearing protective gloves reduced exposure by 99%. Protective gloves are essential to dermal protection. This is a great point. By far the most common area for pesticide exposure is going to be the hands and forearms. We need to make sure we're wearing these gloves. Now again, I'm going to let you know right up front, you're going to get a lot of exam questions about gloves and also about where people most commonly get exposed to pesticides, which is always going to be their hands and forearms. We also see something that's really important here. Wearing protective gloves can reduce that exposure by 99%. Make sure you always wear gloves when mixing, loading, or handling pesticides. Pesticide labels often require waterproof gloves or one of the following glove types: nitrile, rubber, butyl rubber, neoprene rubber, barrier laminate, and Viton. Each glove type varies significantly in how well it protects from different solvents in formulated products. For this reason, it is important to read each label to determine which glove type is appropriate. The glove type varies from product to product, even those with similar active ingredients. The solvent in a pesticide formulation determines the protective glove type. Pesticide labels require either waterproof gloves for solid or water-based formulations, or chemical-resistant gloves for various solvents, e.g. alcohols, ketones, and petroleum distillates, used in different formulations. For liquid products with a solvent other than water, EPA requires the label to specify particular glove materials that provide protection. 1. Note that labels have not been recently updated may still refer to a solvent category A through H in the EPA Chemical Resistance Category Selection Chart for gloves. Read the label carefully to make sure you have the correct protective glove material. Explain to your supplier which glove types you need. Some pesticide labels specify both the glove material and its thickness. As a general rule, the thicker the glove of the same material under identical conditions, the longer the breakthrough time. When we look at the reference chart for gloves here, we can see we've got different categories and what's explained next to them. For instance, on Category A would be any waterproof material. Category B, only butyl rubber or barrier laminate. Category C, butyl rubber, nitrile, neoprene, polyvinyl, chloride, barrier laminate, or Viton. Category D, only butyl rubber or barrier laminate. Category E, nitrile, neoprene, barrier laminate, or Viton. Category F, butyl rubber, nitrile, barrier laminate, or Viton. Category G, only barrier laminate or Viton. Category H, only barrier laminate or Viton. A pesticide label specification of glove type is generally based on a thickness of 14 mils, except for polyethylene and barrier laminate gloves. Use the 14 mils thickness as a rule of thumb when selecting glove materials that appear on the pesticide label. Glove durability is another important consideration. Select a glove that is protective, does not tear or puncture easily, and protects you for the duration of the task. Discard the gloves if there is any sign of wear or if the gloves leak. Do not use gloves made of any kind of absorbent material, lining, or flocking, including leather or cloth. Exception: cloth gloves are used with fumigants. These types of gloves absorb pesticide and trap it closely against your bare skin, greatly increasing skin absorption. Choose a glove size that fits you comfortably. Gloves that fit well provide increased dexterity for equipment maintenance or calibration. Gloves that are too light stretch the material, allowing pesticides to break through. Gloves that are too large can get caught in equipment, and gloves that are too loose may allow pesticides to run down the inside and be directly absorbed by your skin. Select gloves designed to give you extra protection when needed for the job, such as elbow-length gloves when mixing and loading. Wear gloves according to how you are applying the pesticide. Do not use a glove beyond the breakthrough time. When using reusable gloves, rinse them at each break and wash them thoroughly at the end of the workday. Absorbed pesticides will continue to permeate the material if not cleaned. Make sure your gloves are in top condition. Throw out any gloves showing wear. Check glove integrity before each use. Rinse disposable gloves before discarding them. Let's talk about some good work practices with gloves. Wear waterproof or chemical-resistant gloves when applying pesticides. Although pesticide labels do not always specifically require gloves, wearing them reduces your exposure, exception when handling fumigants. Check gloves closely for holes by filling the gloves with clean water and gently squeezing. Discard them if you find any leakage. Wear gloves whenever you might get pesticides or residue on your hands, such as when cleaning sprayer nozzles or working around contaminated equipment or surfaces. Some more good work practices with gloves include: wear gloves according to the type of arm movements you make when handling pesticides. Wash your gloves before taking them off between tasks. If pesticide is spilled, splashed, or gets inside your gloves, take them off immediately. Wash your hands and put on a clean pair of gloves. Repair your gloves immediately if they get cut, torn, or damaged. If making several applications during the day, change out gloves between jobs to avoid contaminating yourself and your vehicle. Rinse and slash used gloves before discarding. Let's talk about how to protect your eyes. Eyes readily absorb pesticides. When a label says to wear protective eyewear, you may use goggles, a face shield, safety glasses with shields at the front, brow, and temple, or a full-face respirator. Use common sense and select eyewear that protects you for the task at hand. Eyewear made of impact-resistant materials such as polycarbonate can protect you from flying objects such as granular pesticides. However, safety glasses will not protect your eyes from pesticide splashes. One thing I want to mention about this slide is the fact that when you're mixing pesticides and you're worried about splashes, you're definitely going to want goggles or a full-face shield. Don't put on the safety glasses and think the splash can't get around the lenses, because in reality they can. Products that are corrosive to the eyes, e.g. danger, require a particular type of eyewear. For example, goggles may be required when your eyes may be exposed to liquids or particulates during a certain application or use. Wear tightly fitting goggles when you are in high exposure situations, such as an open cab during an air blast application, applying mists, fogs, or aerosols indoors, or in any other location where you will be enveloped in a spray, mist, or dust. Make sure goggles are splash and spray proof and have an air baffle system for airflow with no side vents. If fogging is a problem, use anti-fog lens treatments or purchase low fog goggles. If your eyewear has a headband that is made of pesticide-absorbent material, change it often or use a rubber strap. If possible, wear the strap under your hat or hood to protect it from becoming contaminated. Protective eyewear can be worn with a half-face respirator. If you wear eyeglasses, you can buy an eyeglass insert for your full-face respirator that is fitted with your prescription. People who wear contact lenses should consult an eye doctor or their medical professional before using pesticides or wearing respirators. Let's talk about good work practices for eyewear. Minimum eyewear is safety glasses with shields at the front, brow, and temple. If goggles are required, have an eye wash dispenser immediately available. Consult an eye doctor if you wear contact lenses. Protect your respiratory system. When you use pesticides, you may be exposed to toxic gases, vapors, particulates, solids or liquids, or all of these. A respirator is a safety device that protects you from inhaling contaminated air. The pesticide label states whether you must use a respirator, and if so, which type. The respirator type is based on the pesticide formulation, application method, and environment where the application is made. Once again, what we're saying here is you're going to have some decisions to make. First, you got to make sure you read the label. If you don't read the label, you're not going to know if a respirator is required or what type of respirator is required. Also, as I just mentioned on that label, if a respirator is required, the label is going to tell you what type of respirator. So this won't be a guessing game. It's going to be right there on the label for you. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, commonly known as NIOSH, certifies that respirators have been tested according to certain standards. The NIOSH approval of a respirator indicates that it protects the wearer against specified contaminants. All respirator manufacturers issue approval certificates with a chart of all of the components considered part of the approved. All respirator manufacturers issue approval certificates with a chart of all of the components considered part of the approved assembly. Respirator approvals are manufacturer specific. Do not interchange parts, cartridges, or filters between different manufacturers' units. These certificates are typically package inserts with new respirators, cartridges, and filters. Find out if there are federal, state, tribal, or territorial health and safety regulations that stipulate proper respirator selection, care, and use. There are other respirators on the market that are not NIOSH approved, such as Nuisance dust mask and some surgical masks. When a respirator is required for working with pesticides, wear a NIOSH approved device that is listed on the label. And as you can see on our left side here on the chart, we're looking at types of respirators. We have an atmosphere supplying respirator, which is a supplied air respirator, or a self-contained breathing apparatus, SCBA. We also have air purifying respirators, non-powered particulate respirators, powered air purifying respirators, PAPR, chemical cartridge respirators, half-face mask and full-face mask, and gas mask with canisters. Remember this for your personal safety and exam prep. The two types of respirators are air purifying and atmosphere supplying. Now, I've seen these types of exam questions on core exams for the past 20 years. You may see where it says the two types of respirators are air purifying and air supplying, but the real terms nowadays with the updated terms are going to be air purifying and atmosphere supplying. As we just mentioned, there is the two types of respirators. Again, the two classes of respirators most often required for protection from pesticide exposure are atmosphere supplying and air purifying respirators. Atmosphere supplying respirators provide clean, breathable air from an uncontaminated source. Examples are airline respirators and self-contained breathing apparatus. In very specific uses, such as using phosphide fumigants in enclosed areas, the environment may be immediately dangerous to life and health. In these cases, the only kind of atmosphere supplying respirators that may be used are either a pressure demand self-contained breathing apparatus, SCBA, with a full face piece, or a pressure demand full face piece airline respirator with an SCBA escape bottle for emergencies. Air purifying respirators, APRs, remove contaminants from the air that you breathe. These respirators do not supply oxygen and should never be used in an environment that has limited oxygen or is immediately dangerous to life or health. Air purifying respirators may be either powered or non-powered. Powered air purifying respirators, PAPRs, use a blower to pass contaminated air through purifying elements. PAPRs are available with a tight-fitting face piece or a loose-fitting hood. Non-powered air purifying respirators have tight-fitting face pieces that seal directly to your face. They are single-use particulate filtering face piece respirators and half mask, and full face piece masks with replaceable purifying elements. Gas masks, which use canisters instead of cartridges, are one type of an APR. Purifying elements for air purifying respirators. When selected and used appropriately, purifying elements for air purifying respirators remove specific contaminants from the air passing through them. The pesticide label specifies which type of purifying element is required. Elements that remove particulates, e.g. dust or sprays, are called filters, while vapor and gas-removing elements are called either chemical cartridges or chemical canisters. Let's talk about particulate filters. Particulate filters remove dust, aerosols, or sprays suspended in the air that you breathe. Particulate filters do not remove gases or vapors. The type of filter required on the pesticide label depends on whether the respirator is powered or non-powered. PAPR particulate filters are rated high efficiency. When a PAPR with a particulate filter is required, the pesticide label will specify this by the acronym HE. Non-powered APR particulate filters are NIOSH rated for 3 levels of oil degradation resistance, N, R, and P, and 3 levels of filter efficiency, 95, 99, and 100. A higher efficiency rating means lower filter leakage. N-series filters are not oil resistant. R-series filters are oil resistant for up to 8 months. P-series filters are oil proof. For a non-powered APR, the pesticide label specifies an N, R, or P filter to be used with your respirator. N-series filters must not be used with pesticide mixes that contain oil because the filter's efficiency may become degraded with use and fail to protect you. If you add an adjuvant to a tank mix, do not use an N-series filter, as the adjuvant may either contain oil or act like an oil. Any of you that have done any type of chemical application for any period of time have probably heard of N-series respirators. Even if you worked in other industries, you've probably heard of these N-series respirators like the NIOSH 95 respirators. They're very common in a lot of different industries. Now, as it relates to pesticides, I just want to make a couple points here again. That would be that the N-series filters are not oil resistant. So anytime you're working with an oil-based product, it's not going to work using an N-series filter. The R-series filters are oil resistant for up to 8 hours. So if you're using one of these respirators that's an R-series filter, just remember you only get about 8 hours of use with it when you're using it with an oil-based product. Now, if you're working with a product that's oil-based and you need something that's going to work in the long term, you're always going to want to go with the P-series filters because they are oil-proof. The pesticide label may also specify the filter efficiency, 95, 99, or 100, needed. For example, if the pesticide label specified a filter efficiency of 100 for all 3 oil degradation ratings, you could select an N100, R100, or P100 filter. The class of the filter, such as N95, will be clearly marked on the filter package, or respirator box. Always change particulate filters HE, N, R, and P for a PAPR or non-powered APR respirators whenever they are damaged, torn, soiled, or it becomes too difficult to breathe. As you use a particulate filter, pesticides load on its surface. I want to make sure everybody understands this. As you can kind of see in this image here, the more you use the respirator, the more these particulates are going to build up on the filters. So you have to remember the lifespan of these filters, and you have to really watch that, because if you keep using them over and over again over a long period of time and the filters build up with those particulates, they're not going to work well. At some point they're not going to be effective at all. So just keep in mind there is a lifespan for these filters, and you definitely have to understand how those particulates build up on them. You're going to need to use caution when handling soil filters. Once a particulate filter becomes dirty, it cannot be cleaned. To avoid spreading pesticide contamination to you or your respirator, discard particulate filters when they become soiled. EPA regulations require that you replace particulate filters according to respirator, manufacturer recommendations, or pesticide labeling, whichever is more frequent. If there are no other use directions, dispose of particulate filters at the end of 8 hours of cumulative use. There's a great point. How often should you dispose of these particulate filters if there's nothing in writing saying different? Every 8 hours. That's been a pretty standard rule of thumb throughout my career. I just know a lot of people don't follow this. Now you have to remember, if you're the applicator, This is up to you. If you bring it to your company's attention and they don't want to do it, that's another issue. But keep in mind, it's up to you to point it out, and then you have to bring it to your company's attention, and it has to be addressed, because if these filters are only going to last for that 8 hours of cumulative use, we do not need to keep using them for weeks and months at a time, like I've unfortunately seen all throughout my pest control career. Chemical cartridges or canisters. Chemical cartridges or canisters use sorbents to remove contaminant-specific gases and vapors. They do not remove particulates. The most typical chemical cartridge or canister specified by the label for pesticide applications is an organic vapor removing OV cartridge or canister. Always use the type of chemical cartridge or canister purifying element required by the pesticide label. Keep purifying elements sealed until ready to use. Although it is not a requirement, some respirator manufacturers stamp the expiration date of purifying elements on the outside of the product package. Do not use a purifying element after the expiration date, even if it was never opened. The service life of a chemical cartridge or canister depends on the type of concentration of pesticide, the user's breathing rate, and humidity. So we're never going to want to use a cartridge that's out of date, as we stated here. Also, the service life of that chemical cartridge, it can be affected by the type and concentration of the pesticide, which of course you can imagine, the user's breathing rate, which I find to be interesting because let's say you're working in a confined space, an attic, a crawl space, you're crawling around, your breathing rate would definitely be higher. And then humidity. I live in the state of Florida, so humidity would definitely work those canisters or those cartridges down a little bit quicker than if I was in an area like Arizona. These are just some good tips for you to keep in mind. Chemical cartridge respirators, when selected appropriately, are essentially 100% efficient until the gas or vapor breaks through. Any taste, smell, or irritation indicates that breakthrough of the pesticide has occurred. Cartridges should be changed immediately whenever you detect breakthrough in the mask. And once used, an organic vapor cartridge must be disposed of at the end of the day. The pesticide trapped by the sorbent in the cartridge may desorb very easily overnight. If you were to use the cartridge the next day, you could breathe in the desorbed pesticide vapors. Always dispose of chemical cartridges at the end of a workday unless the manufacturer directs otherwise. On the current image, you're seeing 3 different types of respirators. On the left, we have the powered air purifying respirator, PARP, with particulate filter. In the middle, we have the half face mask chemical cartridge and particulate filter. And on the right, we have gas mask with canister. The current chart is showing NIOSH designations for respirators. Take a few moments to review the chart and look at the different designations given by NIOSH for the respirators. The combination chemical cartridge or canister for non-powered air purifying respirators will include N, R, or P rated filters. The combination chemical cartridges for powered air purifying respirators will include an HE filter. Follow the same change-out practices listed individually for particulate filters and chemical cartridges. For example, if you were using a combo chemical cartridge with a P100 filter and detected breakthrough in your mask, you would change out your cartridges immediately, even though the filter was still usable. Identifying the respirator type from the pesticide label. The respiratory protection required by the pesticide label is product and task specific. The pesticide label will typically cite respiratory protection required using a NIOSH TC testing and certification designation. The NIOSH designations correspond to the types of respirators that may be specified by the pesticide label and include TC-84A, TC-21C, TC-23C, TC-14G, TC-13F, and TC-19C. Fit test. Fit testing is a method to select the right size and type of tight-fitting respirator for your face. Perform a qualitative or quantitative fit test of a given mask type on a user's face to select the best fitting respirator. It is important to get a fit test annually and whenever you use a different respirator face piece. Get fit tested again whenever something physically changes that could affect the fit of your respirator, e.g. facial scarring, dental work, cosmetic surgery, or a significant change in body weight. A respirator cannot protect you from pesticide exposure if it does not fit your face. I definitely want everybody to remember these two types of fit tests, especially for exam prep. A qualitative fit test is a method that uses a test agent outside of the mask to check for leakage at the seal to the face. Kits for qualitative testing are available and easy to use. Now the quantitative fit test is a method that uses instrumentation to numerically measure leakage into the respirator. User seal checks for tight-fitting respirators. Perform either positive or negative user seal check, preferably both, every time you put on your mask to make sure that it is properly seated to your face. This also ensures that all inhalation and exhalation valves are functioning properly. A couple more things you need to be aware of when it comes to pesticide safety. You need to understand the positive pressure check and the negative pressure check. With the positive pressure user seal check, cover the exhalation port with the palm of your hand and lightly exhale into the mask. You will feel air escaping through any gaps in your seal. Readjust the mask until there is no leakage. With the negative pressure user seal check, cover or seal off the surface or hose where air is inhaled and sucked in. If your mask is properly sealed, it should collapse on your face with no signs of leakage in the face piece or hoses. If you cannot get a seal, readjust the mask until there is no leakage. If you cannot get a proper fit with a tight-fitting respirator, you can use a PAPR, powered air purifying respirator, with a loose-fitting helmet or a hood-like head covering that does not have to form a seal on your face. PAPRs do not need a fit test, and people with facial hair can use them. Always consult the pesticide label for the appropriate respirator and purifying elements. If you have any questions about your respirator, consult the manufacturer or use online resources. Be sure to review the manufacturer-approved labels for use limitations of the respirator. Contact your Cooperative Extension Pesticide Safety Education Program or your state, tribal, territorial, or federal safety and health agency for help in selecting the correct respirator and any of its component parts. Maintaining clothing and personal protective equipment. At the end of each workday, wash all clothes and PPE. Some items, such as clothes and coveralls, can be washed using a washer and dryer. Other items, such as gloves, protective suits, goggles, aprons, boots, and eyewear, require hand washing. Wear protective gloves when handling contaminated items. Rinse and discard disposable items. Dispose of any non-reusable or contaminated item carefully to prevent cross-contamination or contamination of others who might handle the discarded item. Dispose of heavily contaminated items as household hazardous waste. Woven work clothes and coveralls. Launder fabric coveralls and work clothing after each day's use. Some common sense guidelines for cleaning pesticide-soiled clothing include: 1. Outdoors. Shake any dry material from cuffs and pockets and then hang garments to air them out. 2. Wash work clothes and coveralls worn when handling pesticides separately from other laundry. 3. Load only a few items into the washing machine so there is plenty of agitation and water for dilution. 4. Use hot water and the highest water level. 5. Pre-rinse items by using the pre-wash cycle. 6. Use heavy-duty liquid detergent. Number 7. Run the washer on the longest cycle. Use 2 entire machine cycles for lightly or moderately contaminated items. 8. Properly handle and discard heavily contaminated clothing. 9. Line dry laundered items outdoors if possible. 10. Run 1 additional empty cycle without clothing using detergent and hot water before using the washer for your household laundry. If using a laundry service, notify them the clothing may be contaminated with pesticides. Never wash any garments made of absorbent materials that have been splashed or soaked with undiluted pesticide or large quantities of diluted pesticide. Remember to remove them immediately and dispose of them carefully. Non-woven clothing. Coveralls may be either a one-day disposable item or a reusable garment. For reusables, make sure to check PPE manufacturers' use limitations for laundering instructions. Replace these garments regularly and at any sign of wear. If any PPE cannot be cleaned properly, dispose of it according to applicable federal, state, tribal, and local regulations. Follow manufacturer's instructions, if any, for the service life of reusable non-woven garments. Pay close attention when reusing these items and be ready to change them whenever you think that the inside surface may be contaminated. If using disposable garments, render them unusable and discard. If they are heavily contaminated with high-risk pesticides, handle them appropriately and take them to a household hazardous waste facility. Boots and gloves. Be sure to clean boots and gloves, even if they are worn only briefly. Before taking your gloves off, wash them thoroughly. Wash both the inside and outside of boots and gloves once removed. Inspect these items and discard if there is any sign of wear or if they leak. Hang or leave to dry. Gloves are not designed to be reused over and over again. Replace them often to ensure protection of your hands. Properly cared for, boots should last multiple seasons. Sun will degrade rubber materials quickly, so store gloves and boots out of the sun. Eyewear and respirators. Most eyewear, respirator bodies, face pieces, and helmets are designed to be cleaned and reused. These items can last many years if they are good quality and are maintained according to manufacturer's directions. Respirators require more maintenance than most PPE. When you have finished using your respirator, remove and properly dispose of any expendable components, such as filters, cartridges, or canisters. Wash the face piece according to the respirator manufacturer's directions. Take care to clean under and around gaskets and valves. Allow to air dry. Eyewear and respirators. Store cleaned respirators as well as replacement purifying elements in a clean, dry place that is not exposed to sunlight or extreme temperatures. Make sure that the rubber facepiece is not distorted when stored so that it maintains its shape. Do not store any protective equipment, including respirators, with or near pesticides or other chemicals. Summary: wearing PPE can reduce the potential for dermal, inhalation, ocular, and oral exposure, thereby lowering the chances of pesticide injury, illness, or poisoning. Consult the pesticide label for the minimum PPE required by law. In order to appropriately select and wear PPE, You must understand both its protections and limitations. Then, determine what protective equipment you need for the pesticide task at hand. Personal protective equipment reduces your exposure to pesticides, but does not necessarily eliminate it. Maximize your safety by following certain good work practices when doing pesticides. Summary: contact your cooperative extension pesticide safety education program for assistance in the selection, use, and maintenance of PPE for handling pesticides. Check the Agricultural Use Requirements box on the label and the WPS requirements for any other statements about PPE use in farms, forests, nurseries, or greenhouses. Congratulations, you have completed the course. Please proceed to the exam to receive your credit.